The days are longer, the calendar is filling up, and I want to feel as good as this beautiful summer weather. That's why I've been loving Groons. It's one daily pack of gummies that covers my greens, vitamins, and minerals, and even has 6 grams of prebiotic fiber. So I don't need to juggle a complicated wellness routine on top of everything else. They taste amazing. They're easy to toss in my bag on the go. Plus, they're vegan, gluten free, and HSA, FSA eligible for reimbursement. Save up to 52% off with promo code podcast at gruns.co. That's code podcast at gruns.co.
The Dialed In Angling Podcast, presented by OnX Fish, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Strike Master, and 13 Fishing. Well, hey, welcome back to the podcast. You know, I'm fresh off of an ICAST, which was fun-filled, but then just boom, right back into guiding and fishing every day. You know, as we get into August here, you know, surface temps are starting to rise. You get obviously daytime temps. Some of these weekends have been in the 90s. Pretty incredible, but not out of the ordinary for Minnesota. You know, we don't get a ton of 90-degree days in northern Minnesota. We've had a couple so far. We've got a couple more coming up this weekend. But I want to talk about sort of the dog days of summer, because as you get towards August, you know, a lot of people think of August as not that great of fishing. But for me, I think August actually gets a little bit better than even July. You know, when you talk July fishing, especially this year, the beginning of July, we had a ton of different bug hatches. We have a lot of things going on. And in this podcast, I want to kind of myth bust some of the things that we used to think happened in August as far as fish going out deep, you know, and leaving the weed lines and all of that stuff. I want to give you my approach to finding fish in August, catching fish, not just walleyes, but like a multi-species event. Like if I was going to any small lake across Minnesota or northern Minnesota, what I will be looking for, different techniques, some real sneaky ones that you don't need forward-facing sonar to really have a great multi-species trip. And what I love about August versus other times of the year is it does condense the fish down into some deeper weed lines. Yes, some fish suspend off the edges. You can find them. Whereas earlier in the season, you have some bass that are up shallow. You have the panfish that are kind of all over the map. You have walleyes that are right on the weed edge. Now you get a lot of these fish that will push out of those shallow water shelves and right on that deep weed edge, condensing everything down on that weed line or that break line. So you've got bluegills there, you've got crappies, you got bass, you got walleyes, everything's along those edges. I want to talk about some of the techniques that I've used in the past to put fish in the boat. And then I want to break down some of the current ones that I use with forward-facing sonar, so that for your next outing, as you get into August here, maybe you're taking a last trip up north with the kids before going back to school, but a couple sneaky things that you can do to put fish in the boat. And really, August this time of year can be fantastic. So let's break down some of those techniques right now. I want to start first and foremost with the most simplest concepts ever, and that would be a hairpin spinner. If you know what a hairpin spinner is, it's just that simple little spinner design with a jig head on it. Companies make beetle spins, right? That hairpin spinner where it clips down on the jig head. You can use varying jig heads. You can use different types of paddle tails. But just picking up those spinners, you don't need to buy, you know, a beetle spin. They come in varying sizes. You can buy just the spinners, rigging it up with all sorts of different types of jig heads, and then coupling that with different types of plastics. Now, hairpin spinners for me have been very sneaky because you think of it as sort of a bass or a panfish technique or something that you'd use when you're a kid. But in reality, hairpin spinners catch absolutely everything. I can't tell you the amount of walleyes that I've caught on hairpin spinners, and you really catch everything. So if you've got the family going up north, you don't have the greatest electronics, or you rented a pontoon, or you're just out in a canoe or kayak, This is a simple program that you can use along the edge of weed lines and catch absolutely everything. Okay. And depending on what you're trying to target, you're going to either upsize your presentation or downsize or have a couple rigged up at once. And so here's kind of my go-to when it comes to hairpin spinners. I like to use, just sort of the traditional hairpin spinner with the silver spinner on it. And then, rigged up with either an eighth or a quarter ounce jig. That's kind of my go-to, my two sort of sizes. Now, I like using a little bit longer shank jig. Like a Moon Eye works fantastic on a hairpin spinner because you have a little bit longer shank jig. You also have a bait keeper that you can use varying plastics. But guess what? If you want to add live bait to that presentation, works great. You can do just a straight jig crawler. You could put a leech on there. But using that hairpin spinner is key. Now, I prefer to use a plastic way more than I use live bait, and for good reason, because that hairpin spinner is going to attract perch. It's going to attract bluegills. And if you're putting a crawler on there, what happens is they just eat it to death. By the time it gets back to the boat, it's completely gone. You're going to be going through so much bait. It's just, and if you have kids in the boat, other people, other anglers in the boat using the same technique, you're just going to be rebaiting hooks nonstop. Instead, rigging that hairpin spinner with a Moon Eye jig, either an eighth or a quarter. I like that quarter option just because as we get into August, you can let that thing sink down in the weeds a little bit better. And I'll talk about fishing these spinners here in a second. But my number one go-to plastics, kind of my 1-2 punch right now, would be either a mooch minnow from Crush City or a paddle tail. Okay, the Crush City Mayor. So using either a 2.5 or a 3.5 inch paddle tail, and then using the mooch minnows in those same sizes. I love them. I used to be strictly like a paddle tail guy and a Mayor guy, but once you start using that mooch minnow, it has that subtle kick tail. It drives fish nuts, and I am not kidding you. You can throw a hairpin spinner out, and you're going to catch crappies. You're going to catch bigger bluegills. It'll keep the small ones at bay when you have a plastic on. You're going to catch bass. You're going to catch walleyes. You're going to catch pike, all of the above. And it's really a cheap technique that you don't need forward-facing sonar for. And it goes as follows. Like I've fished hairpin spinners since I've been a kid, and you can troll them if you feel more comfortable just trolling. You can throw them out behind the boat, let them sink, and just troll them. The fish are going to come up out of the weeds to hit them. Or what I like doing, just because I like casting more than trolling, is if you've got a trolling motor or you're in a kayak or pontoon where you're just stationary, throw those baits out there, let them sink down into the cabbage. It's ideal if you can have like standing stock cabbage where you keep your boat off the weed line, you're throwing up into it, and you're letting that thing sink down, not all the way to the bottom, but just about to the bottom, and then just simply reeling that thing back to the boat. You don't have to get fancy with it. You don't have to jig a hairpin spinner. You literally just reel it back to the boat, and you're catching fish. I'm telling you, this simple concept has been around for years, but I think is often overlooked by a lot of anglers because there are so many different presentations. Now, my adaptation to an old classic technique would be using that longer shank jig. Obviously, I love using the neon Moon Eye jigs, but you could put a tungsten jig on there. You can run a hybrid swim head jig if you want. You can put a bigger head if you want on there, like a 3/16 head. If you really want to get down in the cabbage and you're really only targeting walleyes and bass, you can upsize your plastic. You can upsize your mooch minnow. You can put a freeloader on there. You can get as big as you want, or you can get as small as you want. If you want to downsize to a 16th ounce jig and put on a really small plastic, like these new little crusher minnows, you can do whatever you want with that bait, but I'm telling you, it is one of the sneakiest presentations for this time of year. If you have anglers that just don't fish that often, but, can cast and, you're not sure what to do, the weed lines are thick, you're sick of using live bait, this is the remedy for you for the dog days of summer. The hairpin spinners work excellent. I know for me, I always break that out at times where, my customers might be slip bobber fishing or doing something, snap jigging along the weed lines, using Ned rigs or whatever, and I break out that hairpin spinner and it's like fish, fish, fish. If you want to get a bend in the rod where you just want to get bit, that technique simply works. And so don't overlook it. Go buy some spinners. You don't have to buy the pre-rigged ones. Just go buy some of the hairpin spinners. They come in varying sizes. You go online right now. They're all over the place. They're super cheap, super durable, and you'll catch absolutely everything. My next technique for non-forward facing sonar users, and I did it for years and I still do this technique this time of year, and it's super simple. It's a really good walleye catching technique, but it also catches everything. And it's what I would call an inline spinner. And the inline spinner was basically, me and my guide buddies would call it a weed spinner or an inline spinner. All it is utilizing a worm weight, either a tungsten worm weight. I like to use tungsten when I can. I know tungsten's getting more and more rare just because how expensive it is, but either a tungsten worm weight or even a lead 1/4 ounce worm weight with a bead, a swivel, and about a 3 to 4 foot snell with a spinner, a series of beads, let's say 4 or 5 beads, and then a double hook harness. So basically any of your pre-rigged spinner harnesses work great. VMC makes some really good ones. They come pre-tied if you want with a swivel. You can get those options. They're everywhere. Obviously, spinners are available everywhere, or you can tie your own. I like to tie my own because I can vary the sizes. If you do get some of the pre-tied ones, I try to look for ones that have a little bit smaller pound test. I don't like that 25-pound test a lot of times they come with. They're great for pike and keeping pike off. But I like to go with more of a 10 or a 12-pound fluorocarbon if I can. I typically will use fluorocarbon just because it's a lot more abrasion resistant, especially when I'm pre-tying my own. But I'll tie up a spinner rig. It comes with the 2-hook harness is my favorite, a night crawler, a series of beads. I like to put 4 or 5 beads on there. And then probably my classic go-to would be a small spinner blade, like a small, I think like a number 3 spinner blade. They come in different sizes, but like a hammered gold, a hammered silver, or a smile blade works great, or even just a small spinner. You've seen just the double gold spinner type of blade on there, but keep it small. Now, the key to, if you're going to tie your own, or even if you do buy pre-tieds, cut it down. You want a 3 foot, 3.5. I mean, I said 3 to 4, but 4 is getting on the long side, but realistically, you want about, ideally for me, is about a 3 foot leader. And the reason I like that shorter leader is it runs through the weeds a lot better. Now, what I do with these is I cast them out behind the boat, again, using a 1/4 ounce lead weight, and you can use a split shot too. If you don't have any worm weights, split shot works great. It's not going to glide through the weeds as good as an inline or as a worm weight would, but you're still going to get the job done. Just pinch it right above your swivel. But that sinker, the bead, the swivel, and then your leader with the spinner on there with the night crawler. Now, what I like doing is setting my speed at around, let's say 1.4 miles an hour, 1.6. You can go pretty fast, and then trolling the outside edges of the weeds. Now, if you don't have forward-facing sonar, if you don't have the greatest electronics, what you can do is, if you're in a clear body of water, I think this works the best if you get into a clear body of water where you have like sort of sharper break lines where it drops off fast. What I like doing is getting up in the bow and setting my speed, and then putting my baits out the side, right? You got a couple people in the back, or you can even troll up front with it, and then one person in the back on the opposite side, but throwing about 40 to 60 feet of line out behind the boat, okay? And then start going at 1.4 miles an hour, watching the edge of the weed line. If you can see the edge of the weed line where it drops off and you don't have great electronics, you can just kind of follow weed lines and catch fish. If you've got a little bit better electronics, whether it's forward-facing sonar and your trolling motor, now you're really going to get dialed in as far as keeping yourself right on the edge of that weed line. That's the key to these inline spinners, is seeing the fish and then these fish will come up over the top and hit your baits. Now, I would say the drawback between the inline and a hairpin spinner is the fact that you're using live bait. Okay, if you're going to do this technique, you better bring plenty of night crawlers. There's times where guiding, I would literally bring 6 to 12 dozen crawlers depending on the lake I'm on. And that's no joke. I mean, on a typical day, I would go through 10 or 12 dozen crawlers because you're constantly going to get bit by perch, by bluegills, little bass, whatever the case may be. It's a nonstop affair where you're getting bites. Now, the difference between a walleye bite and a panfish bite is that machine gunning effect, right? That pop, 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 pop. If you're getting that, pop, 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 that's fine. Just leave your presentation out there. If they stop, that means they've eaten your night crawler. And with the walleyes, typically you're going to want to use a whole night crawler, just hooking it right from the head, taking that secondary hook, that crawler harness hook, making a loop, keeping it a little bit loose. Don't make that tight on the crawler, because then the crawler is going to spin kind of weird and get an undesired presentation. But keeping that secondary hook a little bit loose, hooking it kind of just below the other hook, and then trolling those again at like 1.4 to 1.6. Earlier in the season, I troll a little bit slower. I might be in that 1.2 range. But again, this is a great way to run sort of weedless through some of this stuff. You're going to catch everything. Bass love it. Big bluegills love it. Walleyes love it. Just to get a tug on the line during the dog days of summer without the greatest electronics. Very, very, very hard to beat. Now, lastly, before we take a break, I want to touch on just throwing plastics. There's 3 different types of plastics that I like throwing into the weeds, and it goes as follows. 1, a Ned rig, an 1/8 ounce head. You just get that 1/8 ounce Ned head with that straight Ned plastic. You can do the Ned rolls. If you look at Crush City Plastics, there's varying designs when it comes to Ned rigs and plastics. All of them look super simple. All of them catch fish. So using just a Ned rig along a weed line, very, very hard to beat. As a matter of fact, I was just down on Lake Minnetonka this week. I don't fish down there that much, but they had a Minnesota Vikings children's event. I know Bill Shirk from Minnesota Bound was down there as well. Perry Good. There was Joel Nelson from Onyx Fish. A bunch of us, including Lund Boat staff, was down there doing this kids Vikings event. We got paired with a Vikings player. You had 2 kids in your boat. The easiest way to catch them for me when I was down there, putting Neds on. I did do a little bit of drop shotting, and yeah, we caught some even Texas rigging. But the simplest method is to literally throw a Ned head on with a Ned rig and just drop it down in the weed lines, hitting those pockets in the weed lines, and you're going to catch everything. The second go-to plastic for me would be using a little bit heavier head, so going to like a 3/16, something that you can punch down in there. And this is more for walleyes, because I do love targeting walleyes in the deep weeds this time of year. I get a kick out of it. I think it goes back to my youth of everybody saying, again, what this entire podcast is about, the dog days of summer. You can't catch them in the summer. Well, I just remember catching them all summer in August at my parents' lake and doing quite well in August, and thinking in my head, dog days of summer, it's really good fishing right now. And so I think breaking that mindset that it's bad fishing this time of year is, sort of what this whole podcast is about. But rigging this jig head, heavier jig head, whether it's a 1/4, 3/16, you can even upsize even more if you're really trying to punch it in there. And just going with either a paddle tail, a mooch minnow, or a freeloader. And again, going back, using a hybrid swim head jig, you can use a moon eye, you can use a heavier Ned head, and just sort of punching that deeper weed line. Again, don't need forward-facing sonar. If you can keep yourself off of that weed line, or where there's really good cabbage. And this time of year, the cool part about knowing where the cabbage is, a lot of it is heading out, right? The heads of the cabbage, if you're on your lake right now, your favorite lake that you like to fish, and it's, fairly clear, you'll see the tops of the cabbage sticking out. Well, if you don't even have a graph, you can keep your boat off of that, casting just to the edge of it and punching these heavier presentations down to the edge of this standing stock cabbage, and I tell you what, you're going to get a tug on the line. You're going to catch something. You're going to catch pike. You're going to catch walleyes. You're going to catch bass. More often than not, just having a great multi-species event on a small lake is what I love doing. It's what it's all about, especially if you're trying to get the kids involved going back to school. So those are my 3 like go-to presentations for the dog days of summer. If you're not using forward-facing sonar, and if you're really strictly fishing weed lines, we're going to take a quick break. But when we get back, I want to talk about some forward-facing sonar techniques. I want to talk about catching walleyes on Mille Lacs, Leech, Winnie, Vermilion, all of these bigger bodies of water by using open water techniques, and some of the things that I'm currently doing right now, guiding to put fish in the boat as we approach the dog days of summer. I'm also going to talk about some of the new product that was launched at ICAST. I know we talked about some of it last week's podcast. Rapala came out with a bunch of new products that I want to get into. So stay tuned. When we come back, I want to break down some more dog days of the summer tactics that will ensure your next outing will be successful. Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site full-service bar and restaurant. The 2 beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. Okay, so, ever since I got back from ICAST, I hit the ground running. I've been on a bunch of different lakes. I've been on Mille Lacs. I've been on a couple smaller bodies of water. After I get done recording this podcast, I'm actually taking my niece and nephew out fishing. I got the day off. My son's going to jump in. Got a couple of honey-do lists to check off before it gets warm here. But we're going to go out and target some panfish. We're going to maybe try to sneak in a few walleyes this evening. Can't wait to hit the water. As far as guiding, some of my go-to techniques still has been slip bobbers. It seems like post-bug hatch, a lot of these fish are suspended off the edge, especially as you get into August here. Talking about some myth busting. When I was a kid, it seemed like, you get into August, it was weedy. You couldn't lie bait rig. They weren't hitting jigs and minnows. They just weren't biting. We didn't have as great of plastics as we do now. And yeah, I would say the bite did get a little tougher because we were using techniques that weren't conducive to, the time we were in, if that makes sense. Like early in the spring, I did a ton of roach rigging, a ton of live bait rigging out on the mud flats on Mille Lacs. You pulled spinners with bottom bouncers. You try doing that on a small lake, and it's a nightmare, right? Or even trolling. Like I did a lot of trolling techniques as a kid, pulling a shad wrap. Love trolling shad wraps. Love trolling original floaters. Caught a ton of walleyes. Continue to catch a ton of walleyes on those presentations. But when you get into this time of year, you have floating vegetation. You have vegetation all over the water. Simply doesn't work as easy unless you're on like a lake like Mille Lacs where you can get out and lead core troll, or there's just not a lot of vegetation on some of the mid-lake structure. But it becomes more and more difficult to do some of that stuff. My go-tos right now still, I lean on it daily, is, at least for certain parts of the day, slip bobbers. So myth busting the fact that the fish are on the bottom, they go deep, when this time of year, when things warm up, isn't the case, because what we know now with forward-facing sonar is, sometimes these fish are off a structure. Like yesterday, I was on Mille Lacs Lake. I was fishing the edges of these shallow gravel bars, so it topped out at like 18 to 20 feet. They weren't on top. They weren't even on the edge. They were off of the edge, but suspended. Okay, there's a ton of bait in Mille Lacs right now. We're seeing a ton of young of the year perch, I'm assuming, but huge bait balls. You see this on Mille Lacs, you see it on Winnie, you see it on Leech, sort of that young of the year perch hatching. They tend to be up in the water column, especially on these dead flat calm days. Well, these walleyes are out there, so they're off the edge. And yes, they're deeper, but they're suspended. And so it's really easy to target them with a slip bobber rig, especially me with customers. I can spot lock. I got forward facing sonar on a pole. I can direct where these fish are at. I can see them and we can cast to them. Now, my go-to this time of year versus early in the season is I'm really changing my depths a lot. So based on where the fish are at in the water column, because they're suspended off the edge, some of them might be 10 feet down. Some of them might be 15 feet down. Some of them might be 18 feet down or 20, but they're all suspended. So I like to keep my depth a foot to a foot and a half above them. So I'm constantly changing. So if I see that fish out there at 40 feet from my forward facing sonar, but they're only 10 feet down, the last fish I threw at was at 15 feet. I'll quickly just do an arm length. So now I'm at about 9 feet. I can get that bait right on top of that fish and connect with that fish before they move on. Now, the problem with these suspended fish off the edge, unlike fish on structure, is they're always moving, right? You're trying to hit a moving target. So speed and efficiency is key. And so throwing that slip bobber out there, your number one friend in this situation with that slip bobber is putting a VMC sniper swivel on there. I've talked extensively on the podcast about sniper swivels, about how they're a game changer. They absolutely are when it comes to casting bobbers on moving fish. And so rigging that thing up where it's slip knot, bobber, bead, sniper swivel, and then a 16th ounce jig so you can get down there quickly. I've really been using a lot more night crawlers as you get into August versus leeches. So tipping that with a night crawler and dumping it on their heads. Still caught fish on leeches this week, but I would say I'm catching more fish on the night crawlers, not just on Mille Lacs, but other lakes as well. And so going to that rig with your slip bobbers. Another thing that I use a lot and a lot of guides are using, it's no secret. You can go to Target Walleye and all of the tournament anglers are talking about it. And that's using a tungsten jig or a 1/8 ounce jig of any sorts. But I like using tungsten just because I can see it. Either the tungsten moon eye jig from VMC is sort of my go-to, but tipping that with half a night crawler, a jig crawler. You can go all over the internet and just search up jig crawler. You can get a million different ways how to rig that thing, rigging it properly. All of that's key, but running that night crawler in line on that jig and then throwing it at fish. What I like about the jig crawler versus a bobber is if you do miss or these fish are moving, so you can track them a little better. So let's say I saw that fish out at 40 feet from my boat, right? And it was 10 feet down. I throw it and I miss it. I realize it's moving left. Now what I can do is cast just a little bit further left because I want to get right in front of that fish's face, let that jig float down, and then, basically swim that thing in front of the fish's face. So you're not throwing it out there and snapping it. You're actually swimming that jig crawler right in front of them, trying to present that bait in front of a moving fish. Now, if the fish are a little bit deeper, you can upsize your jig heads to a quarter, 3/16 or whatever to get down there a little bit quicker so you can float those baits in front of a fish. Now, my absolute go-to on small bodies of water, if we're not on Mille Lacs Lake, if we're not on Leech, but or Winnie, or if you're on Leech and Winnie and even Mille Lacs and the perch are eating you alive, that happens a lot when you're jig crawlering, let's say on Leech, for example. You'll get into areas where it's absolutely loaded with small perch. Winnie is notorious for it as well. Replace that jig crawler with a mooch minnow. I catch so many walleyes on the Crush City mooch minnow, replacing that instead of using a jig crawler. This time of year, when the water starts to darken up a little bit, you get a little bit of color in the water. If you go to Mille Lacs Lake right now, Mille Lacs Lake was really clear leading up to the 4th of July. Right now, as we get towards the end of July, because of all the algae blooms, some of the vegetation dying off, just it being as windy as it has been, it's getting a lot more color. So fishing that mooch minnow, that tail on that mooch minnow moves just beautifully in the water. Walleyes can't resist it. And the other cool part is because there's so many young of the year perch in the water column, they're used to feeding up on minnows right now, that you float that thing in front of their face and they can't resist it. The best advice I can give you about floating jig crawlers or floating mooch minnows and swimming minnows, the bass anglers have been doing it for a long time. The best advice I can give to you about floating minnows is using a light jig head, the lightest jig possible that you can get the job done. You get a lot more action out of the bait. It floats a lot better. And then also using lighter pound tests. So lighter braid with either lighter fluorocarbon or a monofilament leader if you're using a braid inline. If you're using a mainline braid, using instead of a fluorocarbon leader where it's going to sink a lot quicker, use a monofilament. So use a monofilament leader, and depending on water clarity, 2, 3, 4, even 5 feet if you need to. And what happens is that mono floats a lot better than the fluorocarbon, and so you'll get a lot more buoyancy. Even using a mono mainline. Even though I primarily fish fluorocarbon leaders when I'm jig fishing fish on the bottom, monofilament is your friend when you're trying to float baits in the water column. So keep that in mind if you're using jig crawlers, if you're using jigs and mooch minnows. Another Crush City bait that I lean on heavily for this technique, whether you're in Minnesota, in Canada, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, is the Crush City jerk. That fork-tail minnow has a lot of buoyancy. What I love about the jerk and the mooch minnow, it has that right material where it's very, very buoyant. It has a lot of lifelike features, the kick of the tail, and fish can't resist it. They love chasing it. You can play cat and mouse with that technique. If they are chasing it and you're getting them chase, try popping it a little bit and seeing if you can get those fish engaged. If you see them on your forward-facing sonar where they turn up on it and they hit it fast, you're going to get bit. Those are my, I would say, suspended techniques that I'm doing right now on a daily basis. Now, if there's fish on the bottom where you're casting bobbers out, you're casting jig crawlers, they just won't eat, right? They don't want to feed. And that happens a lot this time of year as you get into dog days of summer where, yeah, they'll engage, but they don't want to commit to it. My favorite bait, and has been for a long time, is a jigging Rap. Always have a jigging Rap tied up this time of year. No doubt about it. If you're in Minnesota, if you're fishing kind of, I would say moderate depths versus like the Dakotas where, you're fishing deeper water, current situations, my absolute go-to would be a number 7 jigging Rap. Okay. If I'm fishing a little bit deeper, if I'm fishing a lot of current or want to get down there quicker, a number 9 works great as well. And then sort of a sneaky one that I've always got in the boat, because going back to that young of the year perch conversation, is a number 5. And now what I do, even if a fish is suspended in the water column, but they're not feeding, I'll float that number 5 jigging Rap in front of their face, and then I dump it to the bottom. Okay. A lot of times those fish will chase it all the way to the bottom. Even if you're on a lake with a thermocline, I've found these fish, they'll chase, but won't feed. You dump that jigging Rap to the bottom, they'll go all the way through the thermocline to eat it. It's amazing. Something that I didn't think was possible prior to seeing it for myself on forward-facing sonar. Now, going back to the conversation of new baits, something you're gonna want to write this down, and you're gonna want to have these in your arsenal. If you love fishing jigging Raps, we talked about it last week with Ross Robertson, but the new Rapala Jigging Rap X. Since coming back from ICAST, I have been fishing these Jigging Raps X's, and this is a bait that's well thought out. Even if you have Jigging Raps, you're going to want to get these for a couple reasons. One, the tail fin is almost indestructible. It's got bigger hooks on the front and back, so bigger hookup percentage. And then the cool part is the hook on the bottom is actually, it turns. So you know how on a Jigging Rap, it's molded in there. You've got it, sort of on a split ring. This actually pivots on a swivel, so it turns. That's really good for hookups, hookup percentages. I thought when the Jigging Rap X's first came out and I saw the prototypes, I'm like, oh, wow, they're kind of like jigging shadow wraps. They'll probably fall a little bit slower. That's not the case. They have the sinking rate of a Jigging Rap currently, but they've got a little bit bigger profile to them, better, I would say, embossed colors. Obviously, the swim fin is molded in there, a little more durable. And then I like these wider gap hooks. I've noticed that when you hook up on the fish, you tend to lose them less than traditionally fishing a jigging Wrap. Jigging Wraps catch fish, but that was always the gripe. Any sort of snap jigging technique like that, not just a Jigging Wrap, because it's so heavy, you tend to lose some fish as a result of it. Yeah, you hook up on a lot more, but you tend to lose it, especially if they're just slashing at the bait or if they're pinning it to the bottom. Now this new Jigging Wrap X, the fact that the hooks are bigger, you have that swiveling hook on the bottom, so it's not coming up and catching the bait. Super well thought out, and is going to be right there side by side with my current Jigging Wrap selection. As a matter of fact, I just put together a tackle box. It's got a bunch of new Jigging Wrap X's in it. You're going to want to check these things out. And to top it off, you guys, on top of all, they rattle. Okay, there's a rattling chamber in there, so they're extremely durable. You got the swiveling hook on the bottom, and they rattle. Check them out, the Jigging Wrap X. You're going to see a lot come out over the Jigging Wrap X over the next few months. They're not quite available in stores yet, but you will be able to get your hands on them soon. So those are my go-to techniques. I want to take a quick break. When I come back, I want to also talk about some products that were introduced at ICAST. I know we talked a little bit on last week's podcast. I want to do sort of a deep dive on some of the new Crush City plastics for panfish, the little crushers. There's a new Avatar shad that I'm super pumped about. And of course, Rapala has come out with this pile of new baits for next year. So I want to get into that. So stay tuned. We got more Dialed In Angling after this. OnX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Quickly filter lakes by species, then select trophy potential, high abundance, keeper potential, or high stocking effort to find the fish you're after in the size and the numbers you are trying to catch. Download from the App Store today to get research tools for the serious anglers and beginners alike, giving you the data to target the right lakes and the confidence to get there. Use tools like recent imagery, fishing hotspot data, or the best-in-class weather features that call out current wind, weather, barometer, moon phase, majors and minors, along with precip and more. OnX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you'd never known existed. Download OnX Fish Midwest today, the app that is changing the game on ice and open water. Okay, you guys all know that I'm a huge fan of the Crush City plastics. I love the material, a lot of TPE material built into these plastics. Lifelike profiles, they just simply catch fish. I mean, it's just, for good reason, it's one of the number one selling soft plastics out there, not just for bass, but walleyes. They just catch everything. And at ICAST, I've known about these for a while. I've done a ton of filming with the Crush City little crushers, but it's basically a finesse bait. It's an addition to, the Crush City lineup. They're really small baits. Most of them come in 2.5 inch. 1.75 inch size, whether you're looking at a freeloader. They have a little mooch minnow, they have a little mayor, they have a trident, they call it. It sort of has tentacles on it. They have about 5 different profile baits in these little crusher lineups. Now, these are a fantastic panfish bait, but again, they're really good for just finesse fishing. There's times like on Mille Lacs where right now is the prime time to talk about it, is these young of the year, basically the perch that hatched this spring. They're tiny, right? They're in that under an inch category right now, 1.5 inches by fall. They'll be, 1.75 inches. These little crushers are kind of just fit that bill. You've heard in the past, match the hatch, right? That's exactly what the little crushers do, is they match that hatch. And so you can use these things for walleyes. You can use them for smallmouth bass. Excellent for crappies. I've been fishing, the freeloaders and the mooch minnows probably the most out of the little crushers. But I have fished the Mayors, and I do like that trident. I like the one, anything with like tentacles or that looks like a bug. I've been fishing those. So what's cool about that, we talked to Mike Anselmo last week, and he was talking about all the new tungsten microscope jigs that come with it. I love these heads. They keep the plastics on perfectly. You can get them in 16th, 32nd, but also you can upsize and use like a 1/8 ounce moon eye jig, right? We've got a bunch of pre-packaged VMC moon eye jigs that work perfectly with the little crusher jigs or the little crusher plastics. Love these plastics. I'm always into microplastics. I can't say enough good things about the little crusher series. If you fish a lot of plastics for panfish like I do, you're gonna love the little crushers. I can't remember the last time that I bought minnows for crappie fishing. And especially as you get into quote unquote the dog days of summer, you want to rig these up on a hairpin spinner, like I talked about earlier, or you just want to rig these up on a underspin jig. Like they're going to come out with the microscope jigs that come with an underspin. Deadly presentations for crappies on the deep cabbage. But then as the panfish pull out to the basin, which happens a lot in August, they start moving towards those wintering areas in a lot of lakes where you get them on the edges of the weeds. They're suspended off the edges of the weeds. They're down in that cooler water a little bit. A lot of lakes that I know right now, there's a ton of crappies in that 15 to 20 foot range. And so casting these small plastics in there, they can't resist it. They just come unglued. And it's a super fun way to fish. My son and I, Robbie and I hit a bunch of lakes where we can target suspended crappies that aren't super deep. We don't want to kill them. We just like catching fish a lot of times. But we'll go out there and we'll target these fish that are off the edge with plastics. And it's amazing how they can see that. That whole school just comes unglued when they see these little crusher baits. My absolute go-tos in the Little Crusher series for crappies doing so is the Little Crusher freeloader and the Little Crusher mooch minnow. Yep, it's hard to beat a paddle tail, especially in the weeds, but suspended fish, the freeloader, and the mooch minnow are my absolute go-to. Putting that on a 16th ounce jig, an 1/8 ounce if I'm fishing a little bit deeper, but typically on that 16th ounce jig head is absolute magic. So, let's break down some more products that came out at ICAST. One is that I use all the time as a guide, and it's this high capacity line remover. What's cool about this is it's a very simple concept. You literally put your line around it, hit the button, and it takes your line off very quickly. Now, I know there's lots of line strippers out there. This one's very simple, very easy to use. You don't have to put your line in a little tiny hole or anything like that. I know those in the past. I've had troubles with either not gripping the line or creates a big mess. This actually spools it up into a spool that you can just then slide off the head and throw it away. I struggle with stripping line all the time. Obviously, as a guide, I'm always going through line. I'm always one of freshening up my lines all the time too, because inevitably guiding, you burn through it. And if you talk to any guide or anybody who fishes a lot, line is you're connected to the fish. I don't know how to describe it. I always tell people, like, if you're going on a fishing trip, the number one thing you should be doing is replacing your line. Okay. You don't want to go on a fishing trip and have old line. All of the money that you spent in gas and hotels and bait and blah, 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 tackle, you don't want to be breaking off. You don't want the difference between you of having just a really successful trip is something overlooked, simple, and not replacing your line. And so this high capacity line remover is great. Love it. Use it all the time. It is now my newest best friend when it comes to changing line for guiding. In addition to the Crush City freeloaders, there's a couple baits I want to talk about. Let's start with the Avatar Shad. I think it's a really unique design. It actually has a little lip on it like a crankbait, but it has a really soft, flexible tail, so it swims like a swim bait. So it's a soft plastic, but it's got a bill on it, so it dives sort of like a crankbait and runs like a crankbait, hence the name Avatar Shad. So you can actually rig this up on a jig head. You can vary your size jig head. So going back to that same conversation of throwing plastics into some deeper weeds, letting it fall, and then retrieving it straight back, Avatar shad is going to be just dynamite for that. For casting these baits over open water fish that are suspended off the edge right now, Avatar shad's going to work really, really well for that. Got a whole bunch of samples that I'm actually packing right now. I can't wait to get out and throw these Avatar shads, coupling them either with a tungsten jig head so I can see them on forward-facing sonar or just a traditional jig head. The one advice I could give to you for rigging these up, because they're 4-inch baits, is having that longer shank jig on there, whether it's a moon eye jig would work perfectly, but something with that longer shank on there, and getting that jig head into that bait, and then just making sure that your jig head's not too big where the lip on there is inhibits that bait from moving. Like, I probably wouldn't rig this with a hybrid swim head jig or too heavy of a jig, just because I think it would screw up the action. You're not going to get that bill to work like it would if you put a little bit lighter jig head on there. The next one in the Crush City lineup, the Bronco Bug. If you like using creature baits on heavy jigs for bass, Bronco Bug is a good one. And then, of course, the freeloaders are coming in a bigger size and then a small size. For me personally, I'm the most excited about the smaller size. Yes, I have some of the bigger ones that I bought for lake trout and, obviously pike and largemouth bass. But the smaller size freeloader, I'm probably most pumped about, just because I use them a lot on jig heads for walleyes, and I snap jig them, whether I'm fishing in Canada and Minnesota and the Dakotas, Wisconsin, whatever, Great Lakes. This smaller size freeloader should be, a real go-to for walleye anglers. Just right up there with the Mooch Minnows, right up there with the Crush City Jerks. But you're going to see those things coming out here this spring. One we talked about last week, another new bait, the Gold Miner 20. So last year came out with the Gold Miner 30. It's a real deep diving bait. It's a real Great Lakes presentation, but works really good, obviously, over in Oahe. Works good on Mille Lacs Lake for trolling. But some of those deeper reservoirs than the Dakotas, this is a fantastic bait. Well, now we have the Gold Miner 20. So it doesn't dig quite as much, not as big a profile. I know Ross Robertson was really jacked about these baits. I'm excited about them as well. Trolling, even with forward-facing sonar like we were doing with Marcus, out in the Dakotas is really fun. Putting a forward-facing sonar unit forward on your trolling motor, and then if you have one on a pole as well, pointing it back towards your baits and watching a fish strike a gold miner, it's actually pretty cool. I love tracking baits now while trolling. It's probably my new favorite way to troll, just because, in the past when it came to trolling, I was all about colors and speed and size. I'm still all about that. But now when you can track a bait and watch fish come up to it and you say, oh, they don't want to hit it, next bait, instantly if they're going to hit it or not. It's just really a cool, fun way to fish. Again, some new products from Rapala VMC. One that I'm really excited about as a walleye angler is the Echo hair jig. If you like fishing hair jigs, you're going to want to check these baits out. They're really, really cool. The VMC Echo hair jig. I can't wait as we get into September. I'm a huge hair jig fan. You want to talk about fishing, even deep weeds right now, throwing hair jigs up there. You throw a hair jig in there, goes along those same lines of catching all species. You're going to catch bass, you're going to catch pike. Walleyes love hair jigs. These new Echo hair jigs are really cool. What's cool about them is the head design themselves. The fact that they have that sort of aspirin head design, so it's going to fall really quickly. Everything that walleyes love about that aspirin head design, it's got the big eye, and then just that hair floats really, really nicely. It's got a long enough tail. It's got a very stout hook on it, so you're not going to be missing fish. You're going to want to check these out as well. So that's sort of what piqued my interest. I know there was a lot of other products that came out. Obviously, the CEO, the urchin bait that came out was best product soft water plastic of the year. Rapala, like always, every single year comes out with a bunch of new baits that work. What's cool about this year in particular is there's a ton of new baits that I'm using right now that work fantastic. And there's a bunch of new baits that I'm just jacked about. I can't wait to use these things. these are baits that work. Just talking to my buddies at Rapala in the PD department, other anglers, even being down at ICAST, and just talking about how great this new product lineup is for this year. Can't wait to get out there and use them. This is the time of year that, I know a lot of people shrug their shoulders and say the dog days of summer. It really doesn't have to be, you guys. If you do some of these techniques like I talked about in the podcast, whether it's the simple techniques that you use with or without forward-facing sonar, you can put a lot of fish in the boat. This time of year is a great multi-species time of year to go out and catch fish. So I hope you enjoy August. I know a lot of people are like, man, I can't believe it's almost August already. Just like me, summers fly by in the Midwest. You got to take advantage of it before the kids go back to school and things start changing. The leaves start falling in the fall. Don't be afraid to get out and fish. Even on these really hot days, just get up early. We still have plenty of sunlight. It's still getting light at 5 o'clock in the morning. You can get out there, get after it. Nothing better than hitting the ramp in the morning and there's not another boat or trailer there. You're the first one, and getting out there and start catching fish and having just a great multi-species outing with your kids, with your loved ones, before everybody starts going in different directions as we get towards fall. So don't let the dog days of summer intimidate you. That's all I got to say. Try some of these techniques, some real classics, and you're going to put a ton of fish in the boat. So that's my wrap this week. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it each and every week, you guys tuning into the podcast. Good luck fishing to everybody. I'm your host, Tony Roach. This has been the Dialed In Angling Podcast.